it is worthy of celebration that we made it this far, but we're still less than 1/10 of the way home. The open road beckons and promises to be fraught with challenges, but we can't stay put forever.
You're always there, and you take me as I am. You take me as I am. You don't attempt to change me or rearrange my flaws. And you dare to understand, and still you take me as I am. You've given me a place where I can just belong.
Now that we were once again on the road, we headed towards our destination, Lordsburg, New Mexico. That's right, we were finally making it out of Arizona. The whole time we were out here, I never got used to the sight of mountains spreading all the way to the horizon. And beneath them, here we were in our loud, rattly little box, just barely holding itself together, putting through these small towns. We'd managed to get this thing cruising a steady 70 miles an hour down the road at a not unreasonable 220 degrees, and all it takes is a whole lot of pumping of the weed sprayer. So sure, we're facing some challenges, but compared to so many who had come through this valley before us, we had it positively easy. Our sailing was actually going really smoothly with that for perspective. So despite rolling into Lordsburg at 7:30 in the morning, absolutely exhausted, it was hard to feel that the trip was going anything but well. There were certainly some improvements that could be made, but man, this little red car was doing it. The car could probably use a break, and we definitely needed some sleep, so Sean called around to a few hotels within eyesight and found the best rate, which was also the only hotel that wasn't angry about us trying to check in at 7 in the morning. The motel staff was very nice and gave us the room until about 5 p.m. To escape the heat of the day for us and the car, we weren't exactly against making this a nocturnal drive, so we decided to use as much of that time as we could to sleep and wake up late in the day. We were up bright and early around 2 p.m. to wander around town and find something to eat. The food was good, certainly better than anything we'd had recently, and we got to check out the deserted gas station next door on the way back to the hotel. It was hard not to notice the stains on the concrete we were leaving, and at this point, maybe we should have just called it Puddles the Pinto. It didn't seem like the engine was leaking anything, but the transmission more than made up for that. It seemed doubtful we were going to be able to do anything about it though, so we just had to leave that be. We gathered our stuff from the motel room, checked all of the fluids in the car, and got back on the road.
Damn it. Can this camera even see me? Like, I'm so far forward.
It's very wide. I don't know. Maybe. Other than the scary starter, it's side track. The door's still pretty fast.
You're fine. Okay, hope it doesn't overheat.
It will. Hope it doesn't overheat too bad.
That's already full. That's a record.
Yeah. At this point, we realized the windshield was so dirty that when the sun hit it, we could barely see anything, and we had no idea if the wipers worked, if the wiper washer worked, or how to activate any of it.
Spray. Oh god, it's gonna come in the door! Ah!
You're welcome.
I'm gonna say east or west. I thought it said east. Yeah. What? 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 What?
But unlike yesterday, we decided to go straight for the highway. After how long it took to make the drive last night and all of our problems with the grades, it made more sense to stick to Route 10, which is relatively straight and flat. We tried to do 70 miles an hour, but it just wasn't happening. We were stuck to more like 40 or 50 max.
Oh boy, safety corridor.
Jensen, you were already doing half the speed.
But at least on the highway, we could stay in the right lane and vehicles could pass us on the left. So even though we were pretty slow, we all agreed that it made more sense to stick to these roads. Unfortunately, that meant the drive would be less interesting and certainly more monotonous, though at a certain point we just had to make progress. But even on these flat roads, we were still up against a lot of engine heat and we did pull over at one point to let the car cool down some. The weed sprayer had run empty, which is part of why we had to pull over. It also seemed like the change in temperature from last night to now was enough that it locked the lid on it shut really tight, and it took Sean some work to remove it.
How we doing?
I really don't want to shut it off because I'm afraid
It'll never start again, yeah. It's hanging out at 230.
It's going down. It is going down. It was going okay until we hit the upward grade and ran out of water at the same time. We made it a quarter of the way there. Oh, running so bad. The fuel is probably boiling in the carburetor.
How's it going, doctor?
Okay, and now we watch the temperature drop.
The water seemed to help, and very quickly the reading was down towards 220. At least the car is able to cool down on its own just by sitting and idling. More often, the problem is the opposite, and as soon as you slow down, that's when the car has problems, but ours just doesn't like high speeds. Or, you know, anything over 15 miles an hour. The gauge was in the upper 230s when we stopped, and we waited until it got down towards 215 before merging back onto the roadway. Because of our start late in the day, the sun had already traced its way across the sky and it was getting a bit cooler, which was making the car run better. We were headed to Deming, New Mexico, but this time not to a gas station. We were heading to an auto parts store. There had been a lot of time to think about it, and I still had this idea scratching at the back of my head that it could be something with the water pump. So we had found a location that stocked a well-reviewed, definitely standard rotation pump, and that was where we were headed. We just had to hurry to get there before 8 p.m. when they closed, so we tried to keep the car going as fast as possible. This meant running a lot of water through the sprayer, but it got the job done. We pulled into Deming and made it to the store with about half an hour to spare. The scenic view from the parking lot wasn't exactly inspiring, but we were all feeling pretty hopeful that the water pump would increase the cooling efficiency of the system and fix our problems. And yes, we had thought that about other things before, but we had to cling to something. Fortunately, they did have the pump we were looking for at Autone, so we grabbed it and headed to our usual workshop. Yeah, we're doing this again. We have one more shot, good shot I think, at fixing this. This water pump's a little strange. First, there's no weep hole. It's supposed to be up top and also at bottom. No weep hole, and there's no register for the pulley. I don't know, which is why I picked up CWP 641, which should be correct for a 1980 Thunderbird, and with some minor differences, does mostly look the same. This has 2 weep holes instead of 0, which is good, I guess, and a register for the water pump pulley. Definitely a lot newer. Maybe the impeller's toast, maybe the plate's rusted, who knows? Hopefully this fixes our overheating problem. And while we're in there changing that out, there are a few other things that I'd like to take care of. Mainly that bent steel hardline going down to the fuel pump. This sucks, it's just heating the fuel. So I'm gonna try to remove this whole steel line and run the hose somewhere a little bit less hot. We'll get right to work taking stuff apart, and of course, for the water pump, we will have to drain the cooling system.
Hello YouTube, this is the 15th time you've seen this, taking the lower radiator hose off again.
Yeah, you're so good at it, Sean. And with that once again drained into the pan, it's looking...
It's pretty brown.
Yeah, this is my
That is really brown, right?
That's the
I guess the case seal.
We also were still running gas station hose water, and who knows what kind of dirt was in that. Plus, some rusting might be happening inside of the engine due to a complete lack of antifreeze. Now that it's empty, Sean is working on unbolting the radiator since we're going to have to slide it forward a bit to actually get to the water pump. Since the two are such a tight fit, it'll make it much easier to get to everything with that out of the way. We'll also pop the steel line off of the fuel pump and install a barb fitting in its place. It is a proper inverted flare fitting, it's just too small for the hose we have, but we're going to have to make it work.
Okay, I'm gonna need some assistance. You wanna hold your hand over this so it stops leaking gas everywhere? Then we go dig out hose clamps. Better. Because this is a 5/16 and we're putting a 3/8 hose on it. Hopefully that's not leaking, I can't tell.
We also did a blow-through test of the fuel filter, and turns out it was pretty clogged.
Find another fuel filter, John.
So hopefully it was catching all the dirt coming out of the gas tank, and luckily we did have another spare. We'll install the new filter and fuel hose so that everything is ready to go. We also realized that we should probably check the torque on the fuel pump mounting bolts, and what do you know, they were just about ready to fall out.
Oh yeah. Good. Nice and loose.
Very weird that like just everything just comes loose. Like it's so vibrating.
A lot of heat.
Yeah, lots and lots of heat.
Okay, no leaking yet. Good.
Meanwhile, Sean is trying to disconnect the radiator fan so that we can pull the whole assembly forward.
Not to unplug it like a normal human
It's
being?
not a connector. Well, I shoved the connectors into the connectors and then taped them together, so you can't just unplug them. How else was I supposed to do it?
Once those wires were sorted, next came the alternator.
Give me a big zip tie.
Oh god, no.
Wait.
Somebody bumps the alternator and
Well, don't touch it.
Now everything is out of the way and we have easy access to the water pump, so we can start removing it. This was pretty straightforward and involves removing the bypass hose to the thermostat housing and all of the bolts and studs that hold down the water pump. Pretty soon it was ready to come off. With it off the car, we'll remove the two last bolts holding on the back plate so that we can take a look inside it.
And it looks fine.
alright, check for differences.
Looks like an impeller, alright.
But none of us are familiar with Ford water pumps, so to try to figure out what it should look like, we'll take the backplate off the new one for a comparison.
This one is standard rotation, as far as everything in the world says.
Whoa, what is that?
It's definitely different.
This is the water pump we just pulled off. You'll notice the fins are in that direction, and the fins on this new one, that is definitely standard rotation, are going the other way.
The design of this
It's
one
totally
is
different, yeah.
so completely different. There's no channeling here.
No.
Like it looks like it was just
Just
rubbing
open.
up on the plate
Yeah.
and just sending the water somewhere. It's different.
Which is good, because
Yeah.
the same was bad.
Yeah. So this is it.
This is it.
This is done. We're done.
No, okay, we're done. Let's drive right now.
Yeah, let's go.
It was tough not to be hopeful when we saw how different the water pump designs were. Some Euro Ford 302s and 50s were set up for serpentine belts, which means they have a water pump that rotates in the opposite direction. This whole time, we were wondering if we had one of those on the engine, and the coolant flow was just not very good. I searched and searched online, but I could not find a picture of another Ford water pump that had that totally open chamber like the old one. So while we were able to confirm that the impeller in there does look exactly like the reverse rotation models, that open chamber might mean the water is just flowing through it in a different way. Regardless of the intended function of the old water pump, the new one is a common, modern design and should work better. Hopefully a whole lot better, which was certainly an exciting prospect. Or maybe we'd inhaled too many exhaust and chemical fumes and were just delirious.
Okay, if we make it and it doesn't overheat, can we high five? Can we have a celebratory high five?
You haven't changed a Ford 50 water pump in a New Mexico Walmart parking lot. Have you really truly lived?
Either way, the new water pump was going on, and I decided to give it a bit of RTV just to make sure it was gonna seal. Is that necessary or even a good idea? No, but I was worried about how the bolts kept coming loose and the condition of the timing cover. Sean cleaned up the surface as well as possible with the razor blade so that the new pump would be ready to install. At the same time, Rob was using a wire brush to clean up the bolts and studs so that when we put it all back together with thread sealer, hopefully all the coolant stays off of the ground. And with the gasket in place on the pump and the pump in place on the front cover, we'll start threading back in the fasteners. All of them have thread sealer and will get ratcheted down nice and tight. We'll also reassemble the alternator bracket and get that set back up. Then we can also check the fitment on the water pump pulley.
There's something easier, but other than that.
Okay, minor dilemma. We're gonna need more spacers, and I don't know if I have bolts that are long enough. Well, do we need the water pump?
That pulley mounting flange is at a different depth, which means we need different spacers, and it made the bolts that we were using too short. In an amazing stroke of luck, after digging around for a while, we found two 5/16 fine thread bolts that were just the right length. And so that the pulley actually centers itself on the smaller register on the water pump, we just wrapped it in electrical tape. This seemed to securely center the pulley, and we were able to lock down the 4 bolts. One of them is only in there by about a thread and is kinda just for show, but I don't think the pulley's gonna go anywhere. Along with the water pump, we had also picked up a proper 90-degree bypass hose, which we cut to length and installed between the water pump and the thermostat housing. This molded hose has a nice smooth bend, which is certainly better than the standard heater hose we tried to use last time. Despite some of those complications, we were getting everything bolted back together and reconnected. The last thing to go back on was the lower radiator hose, which Sean once again rolled under the car to deal with.
Sean, designated go under vehicle and spill fluids on self guy. You're so good at it.
And with that, it was time to refill the system. And I guess for Sean to try to show off.
How's that going for you?
Not a single drop spilled.
We need the wettest water. We still weren't running any coolant, but figured we could at least put water wetter back in the system in case it could help a tiny little bit.
1:15, perfect time to hit the road. Again.
It was a little late, but the car was at least back together and it was time to start it up. Which is a bit unfortunate for the other people sleeping in their cars in the parking lot. Sorry everyone. The car woke right up and pretty soon we had a nice idle going. And even with the thermostat closed, we could see that there was some water movement in the radiator, but it was also kinda foamy. There shouldn't have been anything in the system that wasn't there before, so maybe this was some kind of cleaner that was on the inside of that new water pump? I'm really not sure. Supposedly, water wetter reduces the surface tension of water, which makes any air bubbles smaller, so heat transfer is better, but I don't know why it would cause something like this.
I don't know what that's about. Oh god, our Pinto's rabbit.
Whatever's going on there, we'll try to expel all of that, and by the time the thermostat opened, it seemed to have cleared up, so we just kept topping the system off. Once again, we didn't drain the block, so there was still some brown coolant in there, and it made the whole thing pretty brown again right away. The fuel pump is also still leaking just the tiniest little bit, but I couldn't really figure out where it was coming from, so we're just gonna ignore that.
Still leaking?
How are you leaking? Not enough hose clamps. No, I don't.
Interestingly, even after 20 or so minutes of idling, the temperature still hadn't hit 195. This was definitely helped by the fact that it was the coolest night yet and only around 70 degrees outside. But maybe the system is also working more efficiently now? It's hard to say. As the car continued to run at operating temperature, the color in the radiator turned to more of a light roast, and to try to get as much air out of the system as possible, we tried the usual tricks like squeezing the radiator hose and rocking the car back and forth. It seemed to keep taking more and more water, so we were at this for a while. But eventually, the level did seem to stabilize.
A lot of junk floating around in there. Might be RTV a little bit. If it's RTV, I don't know. Could be.
We didn't exactly give the RTV a lot of time to cure, and maybe it was a bit unnecessary. But whatever all that junk is, we need to get back on the road. We capped the system back off and packed everything back up into the car. Well, the parts that there were room for. We still weren't sure what the deal was with this mystery water pump, but there wasn't room for it, and the new one seems to be working at least as well, so it received a not entirely amicable goodbye. Once all the important parts and people were in the car, we hit a gas station for a fill-up and once again set off headed west. Just like yesterday, we found ourselves driving in the middle of the night while we were all sweaty, dirty, and exhausted. But despite all that, the drive was going well and we were making good progress towards Texas. The car definitely likes the cool of the night, but one of the tricky things is that those auxiliary gauges don't have their lights wired up, which is why you can see me constantly using a flashlight to check the reading on the temperature gauge. It's kind of annoying not being able to just keep an eye on it, but after a while you get used to doing that. Luckily, during this stretch of the drive, the temperature was pretty stable and there weren't any surprises. It was getting very hard to stay awake, but we did make it into Texas, and it only took about an hour to get to our targeted gas station in El Paso at around 4:30 in the morning. Making it to Texas, even if we were still just at the edge of it, felt like a big victory.
It's like 75 or 80 degrees out right now. We were riding on 220 the whole time. I think it needs a tune now. It's 2600 RPM. I was keeping it relatively cool, like 215, 220. That's right on the dot, 60 miles an hour. And very drivable. Above that, it feels a little scary anyway. Didn't use the sprayer at all. On some parts of the highway, we were actually doing the speed limit.
We didn't really want to stay in the city though, and found a rest stop about 30 miles down I-10 that seemed like a good place to stop and hang out for a while. So we sped away from the artificial lights of the urban area just in time to be greeted by the distant glow of the sun. It was just starting to illuminate the landscape as we made it to the rest area. This was the second time in a row that we were able to watch the sunrise. And despite the many, many hours it took to get us to this point, the chance to see that orange hue painted over the wide open scenery really helps make it worthwhile. It wasn't exactly quiet and serene with all the early morning commuters and trucks blasting by on the highway, but the stillness of our surroundings and the twinkling city lights in the distance were still somehow comforting. We decided to hang out here for a while to give ourselves and the car a bit of respite before the heat of the day arrives. And each of the three of us had our own way to spend the time. Sean had brought a hammock and strung it up underneath one of the shelters.
It's a little windy for your hammock. A little windy. Is that working for you?
Yeah.
What the hell?
He was committing himself to making the best of that situation, and Rob actually went back into the Pinto to take a nap. I laid down on the bench for a few minutes, but there was just no chance I was going to be able to sleep there. I paced around the rest stop for a while before realizing that my hands were still filthy from working on the car. Yeah, this whole trip has been a bit of a mess and was a silly idea to begin with, but here we were, making it happen. The car was a little over 400 miles from where it started, and we were just gonna keep at it, keep making our way home. But right now, just for a few hours, we really needed a break from it. We stayed at the rest area for about 2.5 hours, and when it became clear that none of us were going to get any meaningful sleep here, we decided to head out again. We took a few minutes to give the car a quick once-over, including the mounting of the weed sprayer wand, the belt tension, checking for any obvious coolant, oil, or fuel leaks, choosing to ignore the small ones, and generally just checking for any new problems that may be particularly sketchy. One thing that was a bit is that the coolant wasn't all the way at the top of the radiator filler, and it was a bit bubbly again. It seemed strange that the air didn't leave through the overflow and fill the radiator back up with coolant. But we couldn't find any problems, so we'll just have to roll with it. And with Sean once again in the driver's seat, roll we shall. We were trying to listen to a podcast on a Bluetooth speaker and ignore everything that was wrong with the car, including the exhaust leak that had developed the night before, and you can sure still hear now that I was pretty convinced was just the collector gasket on the passenger side. Well, turns out it probably wasn't something we should be ignoring, because only about 15 minutes after leaving the rest area, Sean quickly came to a stop and pulled the car over, and once we were done screaming and panicking, we needed to figure out what happened.
As long as it wasn't the drive shaft. I was shifting. I didn't do anything. Driver's side muffler.
And Sean was right. He didn't do anything, all the bolts had fallen out. In fact, if we take a close look at this photo from the rest area, you can see the muffler is already just barely hanging on. So, before he was even driving the car, it was probably missing 2 out of 3.
Why did it not sound like it got any louder? Yeah, it sounded the same. We're gonna have to pull it over more. Yeah. Do not go anywhere near that rumble strip.
Yeah. I can pull up into the gravel.
Yeah, pull it over as far as you can. I guess I was wrong. I guess the driver's side was the one that was leaking. I guess so. Fine.
The concrete shoulder on the highway is pretty narrow, so in order to be at least a little bit safe, we're gonna have to pull the car over as far as we can. This does mean dragging the muffler a bit more, but what's the harm at this point? Luckily, the hanger is still securely attached to the muffler, which is why it stayed with the car at all, so all we need to do is bolt it back to the collector. And, well, maybe clean it out a little bit.
That's not great.
We got out the old bag of bolts and were able to use 2 to hold the muffler flange to the collector. Because of the damage from dragging on the ground, we weren't able to get the 3rd one through, but the 2 on there at least have lock nuts and are nice and tight. Either from the muffler banging around or just from us driving, a few things including the speedometer cable had come loose, so Sean went under there and zip-tied them all back up nicely. Or, you know, as well as you could expect from somebody laying on gravel with tractor trailers blasting by 10 feet away. We also checked the bolts on the other collector, which, strangely enough, were still very tight. So, hopefully they're not going anywhere at least. With that taken care of, we'll pack everything up and try to merge back onto the highway.
It's a nice little present. I think I got most of the rocks. I'll wait till it's very clear.
Pretty soon, we were back to cruising and once again enjoying the sights. Well, I mean, Sean is mostly just staring at the temperature gauge, trying to keep it under 230, but some of us are looking at the sights. We're several states from where we started, but everything out here is still so impressively open and vast. I'm still enamored by all of these rocky hills, but also really tired and getting some nice 30-second micro naps. You know, you gotta take what you can get. Several times, Sean had to elbow me awake so that I would pump the weed sprayer to help keep the car cool as we went up inclines. Fortunately, there wasn't anything too steep, and this route took us through or around most of the taller hills. And soon enough, we had made it 90 miles from the rest stop and found ourselves in Van Horn, Texas.
All I had to do is knock a muffler off to get here.
We were making good progress, but all of that time spent in the car meant a lot of time to think about what could be causing it to run so hot. I really wanted to try tuning it better, but unfortunately we were having zero luck finding more carburetor parts. I called 6 nearby parts stores from this gas station, and most of them seemed to think it was a prank that I was asking for jets and power valves, so no luck there. Something we could try is giving the car a little bit more timing. We already know it doesn't like the extra timing that the Vacuum Advance is pulling in, so we'll leave that disconnected and just bump the initial from 10 to 12. But just driving up and down the main street, it was popping and unhappy at higher RPMs, so we backed it down to 6 degrees to see what effect that would have. It idled well at 6 and definitely ran better going down the road, so we'll leave it there for now and see how it does on the highway. I also still really wanted to try adding more fuel because it would explain the clean spark plugs, running hot while going down the road, and we were pretty much guaranteed to have some amount of vacuum leakage, so bigger jets could maybe help to compensate for that.
I'm gonna do something a little bit sketchy. We looked everywhere, called around, cannot get carburetor jets, and we're gonna size them up ourselves. I pulled the metering block back off. This was running 2 70 jets that we put in there. Tried to get 72s, but 70 was the best I could do. Now I think it needs more like a 74, 76, something like that, but we can't get any. And I can't even get the right size drill bits, so we're gonna take these 68s that I did have on hand and drill them out to 5/30 seconds. That will make them basically an 84 jet, and we're gonna stagger these, so we'll have a 70 and an 84, and well, it's not the best thing to do, but we're gonna see what happens with that.
Yeah, desperate times call for power tools, and the people at the hardware store were kind enough to lend us one of theirs. Functionally, a carburetor jet is just a specific sized passage that meters the amount of fuel that can be pulled through. And yes, the fine details in physics are a bit more complicated, but I think we're past the point of worrying about that now. Yeah, we're gonna go from a 70, which in a normal situation would probably already be too big for this setup, to an 84 on just one side. Since it's a single plane intake manifold, both jets more or less feed all cylinders, so hopefully the distribution won't be completely terrible. Once the carburetor was back together, we piled into the Pinto and got back on the highway, headed east through the middle of Texas. It was pretty quickly obvious that the car was running rich now because you could smell it. It wasn't the most horrifically rich running engine I've ever smelled, and it wasn't shooting black smoke or anything, but it was definitely more than the engine was asking for. And after just a few miles, the car was back to its normal operating temperature of 230 degrees, so it didn't seem to help that either. And unsurprisingly, the car was audibly running just a bit rougher, so after only 42 miles, we pulled into a gas station in Kent, Texas to change the jets back to a pair of 70s. Turns out the station was non-operational, but at least we had shade to work in. It only took a few minutes to get the carburetor back to how it was before I experimented on it, and this time when we hit the road, Rob was our driver.
Don't worry that much about blowing it up. Oh God, you heard him, Rob?
We were pretty much out of ideas as far as anything else we could do to the car while we were on the road, so we continued to just barrel across Texas. It's hard to say whether the engine liked the 6 degrees of timing any more than 10, it seemed to run pretty similarly either way. We stopped after just 30 miles in Balmore, Texas to top off the gas tank and refill the weed sprayer, which had been working overtime trying to keep the engine cool in this midday heat. Soon we were back on the road watching more and more greenery emerge from our surroundings. And we were just starting to feel the transition to a more humid climate. This was a welcome change from the dry desert, but the more humid it got, the less comfortable 93 degrees felt. But it wasn't like we could just turn the AC on, so we were just gonna have to deal with whatever nature dealt us. Soon enough, we found ourselves in McKemmy, Texas, 88 miles from our last stop. We stayed there just long enough to fill up on gas and water before heading out towards Sonora, Texas. And it wasn't too far into this stretch of the drive that we really started having trouble with our old nemesis. It's hard to say if it was the increasing humidity, the grade of the road, the sunlight, or just because it was feeling unhappy, but the Pinto was running pretty warm. Our auxiliary radiator cooling system was doing great work in keeping the engine around 225 until we ran out of water again. Then it seemed like even if we slowed to 30 or 40 miles an hour, we were pretty stuck at 235. So Rob maintained a decent pace because we couldn't afford to keep stopping and waiting for night just to baby the car. The needle rode between 235 and 240 the rest of the way, but the engine just kept chugging along. We were making good progress and had to push through the lack of sleep, heat, and all of the problems we were facing. But just outside of our shaky red death box, the landscape was turning lush, and we had a brilliant blue sky overhead, urging us forward.
And I now see the world turns without me. My shoulders never bore the heavy burden. I was just another person, and the sun rose before the age of pharaohs. And after I am gone, another dawn will fill the sky with no goodbye. With no goodbye. With no goodbye.
This 106-mile stretch took just over 2 hours, and all of the time spent in the car was really wearing on us. So, when we did finally stop, we were more than happy to pull into a motel and call it a day. The three of us got dinner at a restaurant next door, and by the time we were finally getting to sleep, it was just about 10 p.m., 30 hours after we had last gotten any real rest. Feeling refreshed, the next morning we checked out of the hotel around 10 a.m. and got gas next door. Every few fills, we had to change out the gas cap tape because it would get a little bit sticky, but otherwise it was doing very well. The car was also doing better on gas than I had expected, averaging 13 or 14 miles per gallon. We were hoping to maintain that and get some good cruising done today because we have a lot of distance left to cover.
It's actually cloudy today, so maybe that'll make driving a little easier.
Before getting out on the road, though, we gave everything its usual checkup and noticed a lot of sediment in the coolant overflow tank. Despite all the times we drained and refilled the system, there still seems to be a lot in there that isn't just coolant. Right now, we just need to get going, but we're going to try to get something done about that. We got back on Route 10, which was leading us southeast down towards San Antonio. This drive was going well, probably aided a lot by the weather, and at 55 miles an hour the car was sitting at 225 almost the entire time. The high for the day was 91 degrees, but at this point it was in the 80s and the clouds were doing us a lot of favors. Still, we wanted to try to give the cooling system a good flush and talked through our options for doing one. By this point, we were feeling a bit defeated by the whole thing and wanted to see if we could take the car to a professional. So, when we stopped at a gas station in Kerrville, Texas, 108 miles from Sonora, we made some phone calls. We found quite a few radiator and specialty shops in San Antonio and called just about every one, trying to see if we could get an appointment for that afternoon. And as it turned out, no, we couldn't find any place willing to do a radiator flush on our car that day.
I tried.
Oh, okay.
Their number is disconnected.
Fantastic. Even better. I tried.
I
think that's every radiator shop in San Antonio. Good. Except for Walmart. It
was seeming like, as usual, we were going to have to take care of it ourselves, but we did get a hold of one employee who said his boss would be back later and might be able to at least look at it. That was the only bone any of them were willing to throw us, and we were about to go through the city anyway, so we figured it was worth a try. We continued to make our way across Texas down Interstate 10 and watched as the area around us grew more and more urban. It also was getting more and more hot, and we had to keep the car to about 50 miles an hour to keep the engine from climbing above 230. And as we started to head into the city, even though most of the cars were traveling at slower speeds, it became more and more obvious how inadequate our car was for this kind of travel. But we were making do, and after 65 miles, made it to the only shop that didn't totally shoot us down. The shop manager was kind enough to come out and spend a few minutes talking to us. After we laid out what was going on and we showed him the color of our coolant, he agreed that a flush was indeed a very good idea. But they didn't have a flushing machine at the shop and told us that all they would be able to do was drain the system, fill it with water and soap, run it, and repeat that process until it seemed clean. Specifically, he told us that specialized radiator cleaning products are overpriced and that they just used Dawn dish soap at the shop. Now, I'm not entirely sure whether he meant dishwasher detergent or soap, but that is what we were told. He also told us to just go ahead and do it ourselves instead of paying him, since it seemed like we had a decent understanding of the situation. We thanked him for the frank advice and decided to give his method a go, since it seemed like he knew what he was talking about, and at the very least their shop had plenty of customers. But we wanted to get away from the hustle and bustle of the city before trying anything, so we got back on I-10. The farther we got from San Antonio, the more traffic cleared up and it felt like we had a bit more breathing room. And less eyes on us, which was definitely desirable for what we were planning to do. 34 miles down the road, we found ourselves in Seguin, Texas, once again stocking up on car parts and fluids. From there, we filled up the gas tank again, went to a barbecue restaurant inside of a grocery store, and just waited until a little bit later in the day. From there, a little after 7 p.m., we found our way to a local coin-op car wash. Oh yeah, we're doing this. None of us had tried to flush a cooling system in this way before, but it seemed like our best and cheapest option. The basic plan was to drain the system, remove the thermostat, use soap and the pressure washer to spray the whole system out a few times, and then put it all back together. But none of us actually wanted to remove the radiator and overflow and do it properly, so we would have to do it while they were both attached to the car. Sean's method of blowing into the overflow tank looks a bit silly, but actually drained it very well.
Ew.
As for the rest of the system, he will once again remove the lower radiator hose and dump that all out. The only things that should be in that system are water, water wetter, and a little bit of head gasket sealer that was probably still in the engine block. So there shouldn't be any problems letting this go down the car wash drain. But it sure does look terrible, and...
Oh, it also smells disgusting. Oh,
I don't know what that is.
am I wrong? It smells musty to me.
Superheated water wetter.
whatever was going on with what we just dumped out of the radiator, it was even more motivation to really clean the system out. And to make sure we can move water through the whole system, we'll be removing the thermostat. This is a step we didn't take when we last flushed out the system at that Arizona gas station. With the bolts removed, the housing and thermostat pop right off.
Oh. That was hot. Yeah. That was pretty hot. Yeah.
And with that, the system is opened up and we are ready to run some water through it.
A lot of rinse. It's almost hot-free rinse. Oh, yeah.
Oh my god. Oh, okay. I'm gonna go ahead and say that that is an all K-seal. Oh, you boys making some chalky milk?
We couldn't tell whether the bubbles were from soap in the car wash system or if we were kicking up stuff that was already in our cooling system. Either way, we were about to make a lot more bubbles because we were ready to add in dish soap, just like the manager at the radiator shop suggested. I did spend a minute Googling to see whether or not people thought this was a horrible idea.
Never ever do such things as adding dish soap to the cooling system. If you use regular dish soap, we'll be washing it out all day.
And proceeding to ignore everyone's advice.
Ah yes, more crimes. It's not like the soapy water would get in anything super important anyway.
These wires are all taped up, right?
God damn it.
After pouring in a pretty significant amount of soap, we put a few more quarters in the car wash and started to rinse it out again. This was getting good flow out of the lower radiator hose that was still attached to the water pump, but we had another idea to run water through even more of the system. This was to remove one of the coolant plugs at the rear of the intake manifold and run the pressure washer directly into that port.
Oh, well, it doesn't quite fit in there. We'll see what happens. Ready?
Oh, I'm going away.
Oh, that's good.
It looks pretty gray. I don't know.
Once that seemed to be working, I wanted to pour in even more soap. The amount of flow we were getting through the system from that port did seem to suggest that the engine had the correct intake manifold gaskets, which was another concern as far as coolant circulation went.
Anybody want to take a bubble bath? Oh no, poor alternator. I'm sorry, buddy. See that, boys? All those days of overheating get washed down the drain.
Yeah.
No problem.
That's everything.
To better flush out the engine, we really should have pulled the block drain plugs, but an extremely cursory glance made them look difficult to get to, so we didn't mess with them. We were definitely washing something out of the engine, but another thing we had to deal with was the dirty coolant overflow tank.
It looks like it turns black after it sits for half a second. There's no way. There's no way.
And to help us run water through it without continuous mouth-to-mouth, resident inventor Sean had an idea. Yep, that's the pump from the weed sprayer.
No more dirty mouths, boys.
I don't
No
understand.
more dirty mouths.
This positive pressure worked great for cleaning out the tank, and after 3 or 4 rinses, the bottom was pretty much sediment-free. But the same definitely cannot be said for the radiator. Now that it was empty, we could take a good look inside and found a lot of the tubes to be full of junk.
Yeah, those are the ones I was looking at. Yeah, see?
I didn't see those. That can't be helping.
It kind of looks like RTV, but I'm not really sure.
I was still worried that I had overdone the RTV on the water pump gaskets and we had filled the system back up too soon. But whatever this is, the engine definitely ran cooler after the water pump install, so if we can clear out the radiator, maybe it'll be even better. At this point, we reinstalled the thermostat housing with a new gasket, choosing not to reinstall a thermostat. We still had some flushing to do, and the thermostat was just going to get in the way.
No thermostat.
Why isn't the thermostat going back in, buddy?
We don't need it. I mean, it didn't have one at first.
We got that tightened down, the bypass hose reinstalled, and the rear intake manifold coolant port plug back in place. Kinda just for kicks, I wanted to see how the coolant flow out of the upper radiator hose compared to the last time we tried to test it when the old water pump was installed.
It's gonna go boom.
There wasn't enough water in the system to let it keep going, but it did look pretty similar to what we saw from the other pump. After that, we ran more water through the system from the thermostat housing.
With the combination of literally everything we've done, it has to run cooler. There's no way this could possibly happen again.
But even with the lower radiator hose installed, we still weren't able to get upwards flow through the radiator. This meant we couldn't get out all of the junk that was sitting on top of the radiator cores. But we weren't out of ideas just yet.
What if we take the pressure washer gun, put it in the lower hose, and like duct tape it so it seals so we can actually spray up?
I don't think that's gonna seal.
Yeah, that'd be 100%. It has to seal. It'll be enough.
And no, it's not just you. This, for us, was yet another one of those what the hell are we doing moments. But we really wanted to see if it was gonna work. It was now 9 p.m. on a Wednesday night, and nobody had yet come and told us to stop whatever the hell it was we were doing, so we may as well keep at it.
You gonna put the upper hose back on, or are you just gonna... Okay, that answers that question.
And what do you know, after a few seconds for the radiator to fill up, it was clear that this stupid idea was brilliant.
It's like soapy, like foamy.
Oh, there's stuff coming out. Oh, yeah! Awesome, awesome. Oh, there's a lot of stuff coming out. Hell yes. Now we're in business, boys.
Water was successfully flowing from the bottom of the radiator to the top and carrying a lot of crud out with it.
All right, now it's definitely not gonna overheat.
A lot of it's loose. It's not down in there like it was, you know?
That's why you're supposed to like take the radiator off to do this.
I mean, it's still working. We can keep doing exactly what we were doing, and it was knocking plenty of stuff loose.
And against pleading and some better judgment, I poured even more soap into the radiator just on the off chance that it might help loosen things up.
Oh, God. I didn't know you could fill these with whipped cream.
I wonder if anyone has like cleaned a radiator out in one of these stalls before. I'm sure we're not the only ones, right?
How you doing down there?
I'll buy a Pinto, I said. It'll be fun, I said. Look, go run. Now you live on the floor of a car wash. I live here now.
Maybe we should just call this thing the scrubbing bubble.
I'm gonna put another quarter in.
After a few minutes of this process, there was still stuff coming out of the radiator, so it seemed like it was worth continuing.
Sure seems like gasket of some kind.
So we'll upgrade our flushing machine to automatic.
I'll try to make sure it doesn't shoot across the floor, and then I'll get up. Oh yeah, it's good.
Oh yes! More chunkies! Yes! And hopefully by the end of this, we will have learned the importance of flushing your nasty-ass radiator. Damn it.
Eventually, the water was looking pretty clear of suds, and it seemed like we weren't gonna get much more out of there.
I don't see any like clogged things. There's still a lot of chunks though.
Oh man, better than before.
Yeah, it's definitely better.
We really didn't want to remove the radiator, and we're willing to try just about anything that could help.
What's that gonna do? I don't know. I can feel it. Oh god.
We take the RTD, we fill it with like a 1/4 inch of RTD, and then we peel it out.
We just go to the dollar store and get some Selly putty and just put it on a stick.
I wonder how strong the shot back things are. Only the bottom is open, and it has to pull air through the radiator. Okay, try that.
So yeah, once again we had finally reached the time of night where it seemed like a good idea to vacuum out the radiator. We'll push the car forward, down the hill a little bit, over to the vacuum stations.
I think that's neutral. Yeah.
Try it now. Oh, maybe it was in reverse.
How well does that fit over there?
Oh, not bad. Do it.
Try to smush the rug
It's a pretty powerful vacuum, so chances seem pretty good that it picked up at least a few little bits. Also, it was kind of fun, I guess. Once we had our fill of that, we hooked the lower radiator hose back up and filled the system with distilled water. Then we'll get the upper hose back on, everything clamped down, and start the engine up. There's definitely water movement and more foamy bubbles than we'd like to see, which is why we're going to change the water one more time. After a few minutes of idling to get everything circulated and warmed up, we'll drain the system again. And even run a bit of extra water through the radiator. Once that had drained out, we filled the system up again with distilled water and an actual bottle of radiator flush solution. With that in there, we have tried pretty much everything. We'll start the engine up and park it with the nose facing uphill to hopefully help us bleed any air out of the radiator cap. After all that rinsing, there was still some bubbling action, so maybe those people online who said that dish soap wasn't necessarily the best thing to clean a cooling system with were onto something. But, oh well, what you gonna do? We'll top the system off and rev it a little bit to raise the water level as high as possible, then cap off the radiator. And with that, we gave it a few more minutes to make sure everything seemed okay, before folding ourselves back into the Pinto, and just a little before midnight, leaving the car wash. We got back onto 10, heading east, and everything seemed to be working well. We were traveling along at a decent speed, and the temperature, while still a little bit higher than we would like, was sitting at around 215. All was nice and peaceful until suddenly a few droplets of water hit the windshield. The gauge reading hadn't changed much and we had no idea what happened, but pulled over just to be safe. Only a few seconds after we did, there was a clattering sound from the engine. I hurriedly shut the ignition off and we got out to look. What had happened was immediately obvious and pretty scary. The lower hose had popped off of the radiator and dumped out everything in the system. The clamp was still on it and loose enough that it was able to be pushed back over the hose bar by hand. What we think happened is that on probably the 5th time that hose was tightened that day, it slid too far onto the radiator barb and didn't get cinched down properly. No matter the cause, we now had a very hot engine and an empty radiator. There's really no telling how hot the engine got, since the gauge wouldn't read correctly without a liquid medium to transfer that heat to it. But even after some time to cool down, the 80-degree water we poured into the car was boiling as soon as it hit the bottom of the radiator. Now we were playing a dangerous game on a few fronts. If we didn't fill the engine back up and just let it heat soak at whatever temperature it got to, it could cause damage that would otherwise be avoided if we cooled it down a bit faster. But by pouring in water that's clearly much cooler than the aluminum radiator, we risk cracking it. And on top of everything else, we don't have that much water left and can't afford to lose too much of it to steam.
My bad. I've had it.
We decided to take our time and keep adding water to the system, doing it very slowly. Even then, it did start boiling again, probably once it reached the engine. That seemed to fade pretty quickly, which was appreciated because we were out of water bottles. Next, we emptied out the weed sprayer, but it still wasn't enough. We were getting low on options, but still had another large source of water in the car.
You want content, Mike? I'll give you content.
Yeah, you sure are giving me all kind here, but a lot of drama.
I'll say that thing 1,000 times.
We drained about a gallon of ice water out of the cooler, and it was just about enough. At this point, a concerned passerby stopped to see if he could do anything to help.
We have a friend who just stopped here.
We were very thankful and appreciative, but told him we had the situation more or less under control. Nevertheless, it was really nice that somebody stopped to check on us despite our crappy car and out-of-sync indicators. We finished topping the system off with the last of our water, and it was time to see if it would start again. This moment at midnight on the side of a Texas highway is probably the most scared I have ever been to turn the key of a car.
Start it up. It is dead, it's dead.
My hands were trembling so much it was all I could do to hold the camera and firmly grasp the ignition cylinder.
Don't be locked up, don't be locked up, please don't be locked up.
My heart fluttered when it turned right over, and I didn't even know what to think when it started up like nothing had happened. The idle seemed normal, and the oil pressure was as perfect as always, but when giving it some gas, it didn't sound quite right.
It's idling, it's not running good. I hope it's not missing on a cylinder.
With it idling, we poked around a bit and listened for anything abnormal, but found nothing.
Doesn't sound like anything's knocking. So just let it idle for a minute. It sounds okay here. Off idle, it was sounding really bad.
We let a few minutes pass and tried again.
It's clearing up. It sounded worse before.
It still didn't sound good. It wasn't running the way it should, but it was close enough that I was ready to chalk that up to a lean mixture from all of the vacuum leaks. The intake manifold sealed poorly before, and that extra dose of heat definitely did it no favors. We couldn't find anything wrong with it that we'd be able to fix on the side of the road, so what choice did we have? We just had to get back in the car and keep going. Or, well, we tried to, but only got a few miles farther up the road before water was hitting the windshield again.
Once we start going and it builds pressure in the system, cap pushing up just enough to spray coolant on the windshield. And we saw it almost as it was trying to boil over, but it was from between the cap and the tank. It was not the relief valve. There's another cap in here somewhere. We're gonna try to find it.
After our past radiator cap issues, we did buy 2 spares, so at least we had another one on hand. Before installing the new cap, we gave the system a few minutes to cool down and depressurize, and it seemed like it had. Just to be safe, I put a pile of towels over the radiator cap and put on gloves to loosen it. As for what occurred next, what I think happened is that there was still a little bit of positive pressure in the cooling system, and the second it was released, the boiling point of the pure water in the system dropped enough that it immediately boiled over and spat out from underneath the cap. Then, the impressive but often overlooked technology that is the microfiber towel kinda backfired on me. That release of hot vapor wicked right through the towels and soaked my glove. It was only a few seconds before I managed to undo the Velcro strap, peel the glove off my hand, and throw it to the ground. But that was enough to cause some not insignificant discomfort. There wasn't much water loss from the radiator, and we were able to dump in the last of our drinking water to fill it back up. We installed the new radiator cap, got back in the car, and luckily, finally, got back on the road with no more drama. The rest of the night, we took it easy on the car, holding our speed at about 50 miles an hour to keep engine temperatures low. And about 2 hours and 100 miles from our last roadside stop, at 3 a.m. we arrived in Eagle Lake, Texas, and found a motel to stay at. Really, I was just glad to not still be on the side of the road. Glad enough to not be annoyed with the cockroach in the bathtub and the conveniently located electrical outlets. But what the hell. The car and us came out of it minimally maimed, and we had a place to rest. The next morning, at about 10 a.m., we were back in the car, ready to escape the clutches of that motel.
Excited for Buc-ee's?
The cold start of the engine went normally, and when we were eventually able to let it settle down into idle, it seemed just like it did before. Outside the car, it was raining just the smallest amount, but that cleared up pretty soon. Pulling out of the parking area, the car felt totally normal, and we headed just up the road to Buc-ee's for fuel and breakfast. After spending a little time there, we got back in the car and headed out. As soon as we were on the road, though, something felt wrong. It seemed like there was a lot of play in the steering that hadn't been present before, so we quickly pulled over to check it out.
I was just driving and it felt pretty normal. I feel like it felt a little pop in the parking lot, and then all of a sudden,
The previously tight steering was totally out the window because
the steering shaft came off.
Yep, the nuts fell off of the bolts holding the rag joint coupler together, and the steering shaft became totally disconnected. The only reason the car retained any steering ability is that the rubber of the coupler got sandwiched in between this header tube and the body of the car so it couldn't fall totally away from the steering rack. What saved us here wasn't our careful planning, a design decision, driving skill, or anything like that. It was pure dumb luck. If that had popped loose on the highway, there's every chance we would have lost control of the car, and who knows what could have happened. Chances are, those bolts had come undone sometime last night, but it took reversing sharply out of that Buc-ee's parking space to lift them out and separate that coupler. And on top of everything, we had never driven the car with the steering coupler all the way tightened down. In this screenshot from video taken the first day we looked at the car, at least one of the bolts is barely finger tight. And from a different angle, you can see a big gap where it's just barely being held together. Since the bolts were never even close to tight, it's actually pretty impressive that it took as long as it did for the coupler to come apart. Moving forward, we'll have to be more cautious about mission-critical bolts like these. Our luck can't last forever. But at least this time, we managed to get it back together with new nuts and a whole lot of thread locker holding them tight to the bolts. Of course, we also double-checked the other coupler fasteners, which were still nice and snug.
Hopefully they stay tight.
Just like that, a crisis has been averted and the steering is nice and solid again. So it was about time we crossed a few more miles off of our to-do list and we headed west out of Eagle Lake towards Houston. This leg of the journey was going well, but the car was still getting a bit warm. Because of differences in weather, elevation, and driving style, it's a bit hard to make a direct comparison, but it seemed like the engine was running cooler and better than it ever had for us before. Still, we don't have answers to a lot of big questions. Did that loss of coolant last night badly overheat the engine and cause physical damage? We don't know. Did messing with the carburetor tune, changing the water pump, and flushing the cooling system multiple times help? All signs point to yes, but none of them were a silver bullet fix. Has there been an underlying engine condition this entire time, like a blown head gasket or cracked cylinder head to blame for the engine's propensity to run hot? Well, it would certainly make a lot of sense, but we have been able to get the car working just well enough that it feels like if we take it apart to look for a problem, everything is gonna fail. And pondering all of these questions on the drive into Houston, somewhere along the way, I failed to dodge a piece of road debris. I thought it was just a dark-colored scrap of cardboard, but the sound it made hitting the underside of the body made it pretty clear that it was some hunk of sheet metal. The wheels didn't immediately fall off the car or anything like that, so we hoped that no damage had been done. Still, once we made it to a Harbor Freight parking lot in Sugar Land, Texas, 48 miles later, we made sure to take a look.
We hit something on the road, some piece of metal. It came up, smacked this piece, and tore our battery cable a bit there. It's still intact, it looks like, but it did take a hit. So that's gonna need a lot of tape.
In case it wasn't clear, yes, that is the unprotected positive battery cable with bare copper showing. Whether you'd consider this unlucky for the damage happening in the first place, or lucky that nothing caught on fire, is simply a matter of perspective. For the time being, we're just gonna tape all of that back up, put another piece of split loom over it, and tape it up even more.
That's like 4 layers of tape. Done. Yeah, that used to be attached.
Yeah. Is there anything else there to attach it to?
I was very limited in my options.
Do you think we could just tape it up there?
Maybe, yeah.
Unfortunately, there's really no existing mounting point there to attach the cable to, so maybe even more tape will fix that. And once we had secured that about as well as we could, we continued on southeast, heading out of the city and towards the coast. Pretty quickly though, we noticed something new. The cooling system overflow tank is, well, overflowing and spraying out of the vent hole in the cap. This could be something as simple as the water in the system expanding when heated and pushing excess out onto the windshield. So we ignored it for a little while, but stopped 26 miles down the road in Alvin, Texas to see if we can spot any obvious problems.
We just got here and there's no pressure, and it was blowing a lot out of that tank, so we have another bad cap.
Oh, that's dirty.
And more nice brown.
It just flushed itself again.
Yeah.
Just like how it flushed itself yesterday on the highway.
Welcome to Sean's Quick Flush. How may I help you? Yeah.
Alright, just keep driving. Bottom hood is gone.
After my last experience with it, I wasn't about to open that cap anytime soon, so we hung out here for a while. We picked up more distilled water, radiator flush, and another 2 radiator caps. It seemed like we may as well just put more flush in here and see what happens. And taking a look at the cap that wasn't sealing,
Seems like the red cap just wasn't sealing because it's really dirty. All the stuff we kicked up in the flush was all over the seals. It was very crusty, so hopefully that's all that is. It still feels like it closes tightly, unlike the one from last night.
after the system was filled back up and the cleaned radiator cap was reinstalled, we got back in the Pinto, back on the road, and headed to a very nearby motel because we had had about enough for one day. It was only about a 12-mile drive, but we didn't get any more unwanted windshield cleanings, so it seemed like the cap was sealing this time. We arrived at the motel around 6 p.m., which was a very welcome change from our normal schedule.
Oh yeah, we're good. The cat was just dirty.
Pretty gross in there.
And though the room was a big upgrade from our last stop, the view left something to be desired.
Oh, would you like to see Dickinson, Texas? Wow. Oil barrel.
Oh no, he's got trash in his
This is
mouth.
the start to like every zombie movie is the bird just drinking chemicals.
Poking fun aside, it was nice to have a cool place to sit and take a break. Our last act for the night was ending the day the way it started, by going to Buc-ee's. After that, we headed back to the room and drifted off to sleep, excited about the big plans we had for tomorrow. The next morning, we headed out at around 10 a.m. and were greeted by some unfriendly-looking clouds in the sky. The Pinto's not exactly waterproof, and the largely unprotected engine bay electronics and air cleaner are things we'd like to keep dry if possible.
Scary every time.
Luckily for us, the weather seemed to be holding off as we headed southeast towards Galveston. By this point, anyone familiar with US geography is probably a bit confused why we've gone so far south. Well, down by the beach, Sean has somewhere to be today. You see, even before this trip, Sean was always talking about finding an economical daily driver that he could also sleep in. And all throughout this trip, particularly after experiencing the unpleasantness that is the Pinto, he's been threatening to buy one. So, what cool, interesting car has he found down here in Galveston that will liven up this journey? Well, it's a Prius. In a weird way, right down to the color, the Prius is sort of a modern evolution of the economy car that the Pinto was supposed to be. It's a 4-seater hatchback with a 4-cylinder engine that is largely designed to be inexpensive to manufacture on a large scale and get good gas mileage. Obviously, there are a few differences, like the Prius's complex electric hybrid drive system. The car's a 2007 and has just under 200,000 miles.
A couple of times now, but the guy that, oh yeah, Prius noises. 12-volt battery is over here, and if you ever have to jump this bad boy, read the owner's manual first. Right. This is the hybrid battery. That's, the one that everyone's scared of having to replace. That was a completely new battery from Toyota.
The Texas sun has taken its toll, but overall it seems to be in pretty good shape.
Antenna has dissolved, I see.
Oh yeah.
For $3,500 seems pretty good.
Sean and Rob are going to continue to convoy with me on this road trip, but they're going to be riding in nice, quiet, relative luxury.
AC works?
Oh yeah, AC.
That's the most important thing.
Especially if you're in Texas. Yeah.
Air conditioning is the biggie, but they'll also be able to have conversations while driving and listen to music without permanent hearing damage. The car did well on a test drive, and we got to at least glimpse the water. It wouldn't necessarily be my choice of car, and it wasn't something I expected Sean to actually follow through on, but here we are. I guess that's just how far the Pinto pushed him. And right on cue, here comes another example of why the Pinto isn't necessarily the best choice for everyday driving.
There's the rain.
Rob and I hopped in the Pinto to hide from the rain while Sean finalized the sale of the car in the house. And it dawned on me that as long as the Prius works well, this would be the last time either of them set foot in the Pinto during this road trip.
I guess I got a lot of solo driving to do.
We love you.
Assholes.
It's okay, because we're gonna take all of the weight out of here, put it in the Prius, and then you can put the hood back on, because it'll never overheat again.
We decided that the weed sprayer had done its duty and now was entitled to a rest. Besides, if we kept getting rain, that would be a much more effective form of cooling. But just as quickly as it had appeared, this weather passed.
This is like a 5-minute shower. It's still hot enough that everything was drying off. As long as it doesn't get in the distributor cap, we're okay. And we're gonna hit the roads, so the wires should dry out, everything else should dry out.
A few minutes later, Sean re-emerged, title in hand, and we got in our respective vehicles. I tested the windshield wiper, and with that great success, we were on our way. But where was our little convoy on its way to, exactly? We're not gonna get back to hurtling eastward just yet, because I have a friend in the area who's going to do me a big favor. He has a few car projects of his own and agreed to let me ship parts there so that we can make the Pinto a little more pleasant to drive. It has been a heck of a long journey to get here, and we're only halfway across the map. There's still more than 1,400 miles of road between here and home. Despite still being this far, though, we are definitely not in it alone.
I think it's my first time seeing a Pinto in person.
Don't look too close.
Yeah, don't look at that. I like the gas cap. It's nice.
We made it over 1,000 miles in this part, and with a bit of help, we'll drag the car even farther than that next time. Or maybe we should just ditch it behind the barn and drive the Prius home. Okay, calm down. It was worth a try.
Oh,